No worries.
So it's
Bit of background noise here too. There's a garbage truck doing the delivery, so I'll just try to be clear.
Yeah, sure. I can't hear it, so that's probably a good sign. All right, cool. So welcome back to the channel. We're here with CEO and founder of Beefledger Australia, Warwick Powell. How are you?
I'm well. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for asking. Just a couple quick questions for today's interview. Firstly, how does blockchain actually work within supply chains?
Yeah, look, blockchains work in a few different ways. It really depends on what you think about the technology itself. The probably more mainstream direct application case is to use the technology as a way of storing data as new product states, I guess, are updated. So, for example, supply chains, generally speaking, are processes by which things are or resources are transformed through activities and processes into new things, and they get moved along. And the activities in those various processes, I guess, are things that can be dataized, and that data can be put onto a blockchain. That's one way, and that's just looking at storing data and I guess what I'd call the track and trace function.
Yeah.
For us, though, yep.
I was going to say traditionally, well, I suppose typically now, not so much traditionally. How does that actually work as a function? How do you actually store the data?
Traditionally, the data would be stored on different silos, typically in each of the nodes, particularly if each of the nodes along a supply chain are controlled by a different actor. So the aim of blockchain in this context is to create a common database between different actors to enhance data sharing, and through that process, streamline a bit of the flow of information within a supply chain. That's the theory. I think the reality is that there has actually been, for the last 20 odd years, some significant developments in asset tracking without blockchain technologies. And a lot of the blockchain supply chain projects have probably landed on the scene without realizing that, in fact, the space that they were touching was relatively mature. So, we've all experienced the ability to track the movement of things by Star Trek Express, for example. Through international courier delivery. So ever since Amazon really emerged on the global e-commerce landscape and fine-tuned their delivery systems, we have in this world actually benefited from significant digitalization of asset tracking. So I don't think that part's particularly novel insofar as a solution from a blockchain perspective is concerned. The more novel features, if you will, I think go towards how it is that we even come to agree that a particular set of information is valid for a group of actors to rely upon as a basis for going about doing our business, the things that we do together as transacting businesses. And of course, the opportunity to use supply chains, not just as a backward looking technology, because that's what a lot of the tracking and tracing is largely about. It's really about that rear vision view about how something came about. But to use blockchain technologies as a way of deploying smart contracts that point to the future. So a lot of the work that we do in the context of blockchains in supply chains is developing mechanisms, economic mechanisms, utilizing game theory and mechanism design theory to specify a desired future state, and the mechanisms by which we can incentivize actors to do the things necessary to satisfy those desired future states. So for us, blockchains is as much about the ability to shape behaviors looking forward, as opposed to simply being a record of the past.
Well, you touched on a good subject there. I think it comes in terms of normalizing blockchain culture and traceability and accountability. So with that said, how does Beefledger plan to become, I suppose, the go-to supply chain rather than other, even agricultural based supply chains or blockchain supply chain solutions at the moment?
Sure. Look, again, I think that it is going to be horses for courses. Anybody who suggests that there is a single universal solution for all things is kidding themselves. And so we focus on a few core aspects. Beefledger is actually built on a fairly generalized supply chain tracking and payments infrastructure that is applicable to more than one asset class. I guess that's probably the first thing I should mention, but beef is what we've become most well known for. We focus, of course, on asset tracking because that's foundational. But for us, it's all about behavior and how we use the mechanisms that we can build in through smart contracts to shape behavior, number one, and streamline transactions as a result of that. And through the ability to streamline transactions on the back of credible information about assets and securities, we're able to fundamentally revisit how supply chain finance works. So for us, asset tracking is sort of just something that you need to do, but it's actually not the value proposition. The value proposition is access to credentialed marketplaces, wholesale markets and retail markets, where only credentialed products are available for sale. So that builds consumer confidence and buy-side confidence, and the ability for us to refinance supply chains through the provision of cheaper finance and new financial products.
And when you say cheaper finance, what does that necessarily refer to?
Sure, supply chain finance, and particularly in the agricultural space, can be a very expensive arena. So in livestock finance, for example, livestock finance traditionally incurs interest rates of between 11 and 14%, inclusive of fees and charges, from conventional lenders. We're able to bring that down substantially and, in fact, introduce new financial products that aren't necessarily interest-based loans, but are actually performance-based partnerships where we share risks and share upside with producers and brand owners. So once again, we're able to innovate financial products by virtue of our ability to focus on securing the assets, driving streamlined transactions with informational certainty, and be able to hold actors to account for the behaviours that they engage in.
Okay, cool. And I suppose just to expand on that in terms of the benefits and adoption, I think you've kind of made it clear what the consumer has to gain from it, but what do the supplier have to actually gain from blockchain, Beefledger, I suppose?
Look, the main thing that suppliers get from these processes is streamlined compliance. That's one. Food supply chains are increasingly complex compliance minefields, particularly in a post-COVID landscape where health and safety are becoming areas of greater public attention. So streamlining that and reducing the costs of that is an important feature of blockchain technologies going forward. Now, I don't say that blockchain is necessarily in and of itself the reason why we can achieve streamlining, but it certainly enables us to achieve streamlining through data sharing and by bringing in the relevant actors early in processes to validate the information as we go along a supply chain. So that's the first thing. The second thing that suppliers can benefit from is access to credentialed marketplaces. So rather than conventional markets where you're looking at only being able to sell to markets where there are many layers of wholesalers involved, we're now able to reach further down the supply chain and create tighter relationships between either group buyers or, in fact, B2C end consumers. So that's your second benefit. And the third benefit is ultimately the ability to access cheaper, more relevant finance products in the supply chain itself so that you can finance your product flow, your production flow, and ultimately grow your business as well by working closely with your buy side and the financiers who support the buy side in the blockchain.
Okay, cool. And through all of this, you guys won the 2020 Good Design Award, is that correct?
Yeah, we won two Good Design Australia awards this year, the 2020 Good Design Australia Awards. Good Design Australia has been the preeminent design awards for the last 60 odd years. It came out of the industrial design environment and has progressively evolved into the pinnacle of design excellence right across the board. So our project, in terms of smart contract design, as well as some of our community engagement and community impact projects, were deemed to be worthy of collecting a couple of awards. So that's a real pat on the back to the team and the collaborations that we've engaged in with researchers at Queensland University of Technology.
Yeah, cool. That's actually how I found out about Beefledger, was just reading an article about the 2020 Good Design Award. And cool. I personally think it's a great idea. Good for the beef industry, which is kind of struggling at the moment. I'm sure you'd agree, especially with a lot of, well, it could be first on the chopping block in terms of a lot of sanctions that are coming in from China and all that kind of economic fun stuff.
Look, it's a challenging supply chain in one level. and there are structural as well as cyclical issues impacting the global marketplace for beef. But I guess blockchains are useful for things like food systems because they can open up prospects for fundamental changes in the way that those supply chains are financed. So agribusiness as an investment class has traditionally not been high on the list of priorities for investors and institutional investors. It's a class that people have struggled to understand. It obviously does have some exposures to commodity market fluctuations as well as climatic risk and geographical risk and those sorts of things. So it's been a difficult asset class for mainstream investment managers to focus on. What the blockchain allows us to do is firstly to globalize the focus. We can generate new financial instruments such as fractionalization of cattle or box beef assets, so that it opens the market up to a whole new range of potential investors. It allows us to risk mitigate by having that spatial spread and by having that certainty through the visibility of data into the future in terms of the buy side through our smart contracts. We're able to reduce risks considerably and therefore reduce costs. So I think we can, over the next 2 to 3 years, actually create some very significant, groundbreaking, global risk mitigated investment opportunities for investors of all shapes and sizes to actually become part and parcel of the food supply systems that we all benefit from. So instead of just being, the passive consumers at the end of the supply chain, tucking into a steak or whatever, we can actually use that knowledge, the fact that we will buy this product, to advantage, namely to provide certainty to the investment activity itself. If I know that people like me and groups of people like me and people that I've pulled together are collectively investing in these systems, knowing that we're also going to buy the end product, that takes away a lot of the risk. And that, I think, is the future.
Okay, cool. And with that said, how do you guys vary from, I suppose VeChain would be a main competitor of yours in terms of agricultural supply chains. How do you guys differ from them, for example, as just one example of a competitor?
Look, I tend not to talk about others. I think that they can speak for themselves. I guess what we focus upon are some of our key distinguishing features. Our distinguishing features is actually a commitment to decentralization all the way down. So we have designed a blockchain infrastructure that enables the decentralized ownership of nodes themselves, not just on virtual machines in the cloud somewhere, through one of the big web-based cloud service providers, but actually through the deployment of physical computers that farmers and producers and shop owners and anyone who's interested in supply chain integrity can actually deploy one of these machines and be part of the network. There are no limitations on the number of people who can be nodes and validator nodes. That's a very significant difference. A lot of other supply chain blockchain projects actually limit the number of people who can be validator nodes so as to concentrate the ability to capture value from everyone else. So we actually spread the opportunity to grow revenues through decentralization all the way down. The other things that we do is that we've built protocols that enable multiple actors to be engaged into the processes of data validation itself. So a lot of blockchain projects purely see blockchains as decentralized or quasi-decentralized storage systems, right? So when someone says it's on the blockchain, what they really mean is that there's a multiple number of computers that maintain a copy of the same database and keep each other honest, so to speak. But that in and of itself doesn't solve a more fundamental problem, and that is the rubbish in, rubbish out problem. So just because I can say that I've got all this data stored on a decentralized network that has 100 validators or whatever, it doesn't mean that that data is actually any good from the point of view of the system users themselves. So what we've got is an approach that introduces multi-sigs as a protocol that enables participants in the supply chain to actually build trust in the data that they collectively take responsibility for. We've also introduced the idea of a community attestation layer. And what that means is that anyone in the community will be able to have a say over whether or not they think the data that's on the blockchain is, robust or accurate or credible. Now, that community attestation layer doesn't stop information going onto the blockchain, but it provides a lens through which people across the whole supply chain are able to look at this information through and say, you know what, that group of people proposed something. They proposed an event update and a bunch of data that's gone onto the blockchain, and hundreds of other people have also taken a look at that and given it the green tick. That gives the community at large a much greater level of confidence in data validity and the ability to rely upon that data. Very different from the idea where one person can just make a claim and now it's stored on a blockchain. That's the fundamental difference. And it is about decentralization all the way down.
And just to throw you a curveball in terms of decentralization, the Beef token itself, is that a pre-mine? Because it is ERC20, I believe.
Yep, pre-mine. And ultimately, the vast majority of the tokens are either locked up in escrows. There is an interesting discussion for us, and it's one that we'll engage the community in going forward a lot more, is when we originally designed the economics, if you will, of the ecosystem, one of the key issues in supply chain economies is to ensure sufficient liquidity, right? So we designed the Beef token not with the idea that you limit supply purely so that you can somehow drive this idea of scarcity, but it was to provide some level of certainty to players going forward. Now, of course, when you can have 8 decimal places on something, there's a lot of life in a particular measure of value and how it is relative to things. But we squared off 30% of the tokens from a policy point of view for future liquidity reserves, but haven't yet come to a view as to exactly what the regimes are to govern the release of that in the event that there are liquidity needs within an ecosystem. So I'll give you an example. A very classic discussion around these liquidity issues comes from, well-known economist Paul Krugman, who in many of his books uses the same example. And it is babysitting amongst the babysitting collective of workers in Washington, DC. So a bunch of people who worked in Congress realized that they were all of a similar age and they all had kids and they needed babysitting services. They decided to form a co-op and they issued tokens so that if I babysat someone's kids for an hour, I'd be able to have a 1 hour's worth of babysitting from someone else. What happened in reality, because they only had a limited number of tokens, vouchers, is that people would hoard they'd do lots of babysitting and hoard all the babysitting tokens with a view that they could redeem days of babysitting services coming up into the future. Now, of course, it meant that there weren't enough vouchers out there within the ecosystem to enable people who didn't need the 1 hour or 2 hours here and there to be able to exchange those services. Now, a lot of those people worked in Congress, so their first reaction as people who were, involved in the legislative processes was to try and frame up some rules. So like good lawyers, they decided to regulate this question. That didn't work very well, actually. And what they ultimately ended up doing was realizing that they had to issue a whole bunch of new vouchers into the ecosystem to maintain liquidity. So we're very mindful of that you do need in supply chain systems the ability to ensure that there is sufficient liquidity there so that the real economy can continue moving. Not much point having a bunch of beef stuck on the dock somewhere because people are hoarding beef tokens and not enabling the transactions to take place. So that's not our design intent. Our approach to tokens is that there are 3 types of tokens within our economic ecosystem, and they perform very different functions. So the beef token is principally a means of payment token. It is there to lubricate and provide liquidity for the exchange of value. It's also a way by which network services are paid for, so-called gas on our POA network and those sorts of things. People can also use those tokens to purchase real products. So there's a range of actual real services and activities that people use beef tokens for. We also have asset tokens, and those asset tokens are minted in our network when we register real assets through the scanning of ear tags or QR codes from box products. So we manage and create inventory register inventory to the blockchain, and mint ERC721 tokens. So these are NFTs, but instead of using NFTs for small numbers of collectibles, which of course is a fantastic use case for NFTs, we use them actually in a very broadcast sense, so that we acknowledge that every animal is unique, every box of meat's unique, and they can all be represented by a unique certificate, which not only enables us to track the assets as they move through the supply chain, but also to manage the transactions around custody and ownership. The third kind of token that we have is actually an asset-backed security, right? And those, of course, are actually fundamentally driven through regulated means. But what we do is that we create a digitalized version of conventional or conventionally conceived of securities, such as units and unit trusts. And the reason why we do that is to make it easier for investors to come in and out, to create more convenience and liquidity for people who may have invested in units in a unit trust, but want to come in and out of those projects and opportunities. One of the frustrations for people who've invested in unit trusts historically is the difficulties in finding buyers if they need to sell their units, because of, personal circumstance or whatever. Or of course, if you're really into a project and you wanted to buy more units, how do you find someone who's got them and are willing to trade them with you? So the digitalization process really is aimed to make the opportunities more available, more convenient, and more liquid for investors, but in an appropriately regulated environment. So that's our approach to tokens.
Yeah, okay, cool. And what's your take on, I suppose, the crypto space in Australia and where it is now and where it's going, I suppose?
Yeah, look, Australia has, I think, evolved over the last 5 years or so to be a relatively crypto-friendly ecosystem. And I say relatively because all these things are relative and not absolute. Some countries are less open to cryptocurrencies and some are more open. But Australia, I think, is relatively friendly. I think also that the awareness in the community around the role of cryptocurrency-like technologies is growing as well. And that means that there will be a growing awareness of the opportunities for people to get involved in this particular class of economic activity, as well as class of assets themselves. I think one of the interesting things that's happening, of course, is that crypto is a very, very new space as far as an asset class is concerned. And so it's taking some time to find its feet, for people to figure out exactly what the drivers are of value within cryptocurrencies and how they relate to other asset classes and how they relate to the world of real economic activity. And I think that the emergence of decentralized finance, particularly this year, will open pathways by which we are able to connect up the world of crypto and decentralized asset management with real world activities, not only in local context, but also in global context. And 2021 in that regard, I think, will be a very, very significant and interesting year as these new technologies and these new ways of thinking about assets are increasingly consolidated and bedded down into the real world of economic activity. So I'm looking forward, I think, very much to the emergence of new decentralized asset management solutions, whether they're in supply chains or whether they're in trade finance or whether they're in other asset classes, mining, small project, whatever it happens to be. I'm looking forward to how these technologies really generate opportunities for ordinary people to safely and transparently participate in investing in the economic futures that they all want together.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. How do you think, say, Australia compares to, I know a focus country of Beefledger is obviously China in the beef industry, but how does it compare to China, and where do you think that, blockchain is gaining the most sort of traction, if you will?
Look, China is very committed to blockchain as a technology. That decision really was consolidated late last year, about 14 months ago, by essentially the country's national cabinet, that resolved that blockchain was to be one of the key platform technologies going forward. So I don't think that there is any doubt that the world's largest economy on purchasing power parity terms is going to go down this path. The blockchain piece from China's point of view is part of a broader game plan around digitalization. So the digitalization of the economy and the creation of the digitalized economy is central to the next 5 to 10 years economic growth strategy for China. Now, that represents a significant opportunity for countries all around the world that trade with China, and also for Australia. And I'll put aside present, short-term tensions and sort of take half a step back and take the bigger view. The reality is that Australia is a trading nation. We do trade, obviously, a lot with China. It is Australia's biggest trading partner. We have recently signed, together with China, Japan, Korea, and New Zealand, an agreement with the 10 ASEAN countries to create the largest free trade agreement that the world has ever seen. So that's the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Mm-hmm. An important part of that are going to be the rules that will govern e-commerce. And that space is one that all the countries are going to need to sit around tables together and actually nut out the frameworks that are agreeable to all the parties. The one great thing about these multilateral frameworks and agreements is that it brings people to the table. Instead of having side deals, one-on-one side deals, we're actually creating standards and common frameworks. And that will streamline trade, reduce costs, reduce frictions, deliver greater confidence in trade flows, investment flows, for all participating countries and the businesses and the communities within them all. So I think we need to jump on the fact that digitalisation will be a big part of the RCEP future. The Commonwealth Government earlier this year launched the National Blueprint, Blockchain Blueprint, and that lays some foundations for how Australia can prioritise our engagement in the development of the 21st century digital economy. And we need to approach all of this with a constructive, open mind that is focused on identifying areas of common interests so that we can take the agendas forward in a productive manner. So I think there is great opportunity, but we need to have a mindset that is multilateral in nature, that is focused on negotiating win-win-win-win times whatever, many players at a table, and ultimately move increasingly towards a world where there are data standards and cross-chain standards to govern the ways in which different data networks will interoperate with each other.
Awesome, Warwick. Thanks for your time, mate. You've been absolutely awesome. Where can people get in contact with yourself and Beefledger on social media or what have it?
They can find me on LinkedIn. Look for Warwick Powell. That's pretty straightforward. Where else? Website, beefledger.io. There's a contact form. Join our newsletter there. Hunt me down on Twitter. I think the handle is at Beefledger1, something like that. Someone else grabbed Beefledger before I did. I can't believe it.
Yeah.
And Beefledger, we're also on LinkedIn as well, Beefledger itself. So you can certainly look us up there. We're active in the Telegram space. So again, if you're in Telegram, then just have a look for Beefledger, and there's a global chat group. You're welcome to get involved in that. Very diverse cross-section. There's a bunch of serious folk on there, a bit like me. And there's a couple of folk on there who, just love having a chin wag about food and steak and cooking barbecues and all that sort of stuff. So very diverse bunch of people, but just reach out.
Yep, awesome. I'll second that one. The Telegram group is quite fun. Good for food, good for tokenization of friends, if you will.
Absolutely.